Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the sixth part of GSA 100, Searching Windows File Shares. In this session, we'll learn about how to use the File System Connector to crawl and serve secure file system content. The File System Connector is primarily designed to work with Windows file shares. Windows uses the Server Message Block or SMB protocol. You may also see references to Common Internet File System or CIFS. Both of these are identical for our purposes. Unix servers can host SMB file shares using Samba. The File System Connector also can support Network File System, a common file system native to Unix, and Distributed File System, a superset of SMB. SMB exposes underlying file system features, such as file properties and ACLs, permissions on each individual file. ACLs are inherited in NTFS. If you create a file in a folder, it will inherit the permissions of that folder. File shares also have permissions set at the share level. The connector respects all of these permissions. The File System Connector will crawl your SMB shares and build a content feed containing your files. This content feed will contain ACLs so that secure searches can perform authorization without asking the file server. As discussed in earlier training, we call this early binding authorization. The File System Connector is available onboard and offboard. We recommend the use of offboard connectors for production environments as they provide better performance and better support for redundancy. The onboard connector is effectively limited to 500,000 documents or fewer. As discussed in the earlier training, you will also want to use the Active Directory Groups connector to retrieve group membership information from the AD server instead of retrieving that information at serve time as part of the authentication process. If you have multiple file systems, you may use multiple instances of the File System Connector to crawl each one individually, or you can use one connector to crawl up to 24 servers. It's not required to use multiple connectors unless you want to scale your crawl performance. The File System Connector supports SMB 1.0 shares. It supports the use of security attributes for shares, underlying folders, and individual files. Like other connectors that retrieve ACLs, it can be used with any authentication mechanism that returns a verified identity, such as LDAP and web server authentication. It does not handle NFS directly, but can be made to work with NFS through modifying the connector source code. This, as you can imagine, is not trivial, and you may find it easier to just install Samba or an Apache web server to serve files stored in NFS. Installing Samba will let you use the File System Connector without modification, and installing an Apache web server will bypass the need for the connector altogether. The connector does not support SMB 2.0 or higher, NFS 4, or NFS authorizations. It also doesn't support all DFS features, but it does support DFS with either a standalone DFS route or a domain-based DFS route. To configure the onboard connector, go to Connector Management, then Connectors. Add a connector from Connector Manager 0, which is the onboard connector manager. To configure the offboard connector, you will first have to download and install the connector software. This is available in an easy-to-use installer that will install everything you need: a connector manager, the connector software, and the connection from the GSA to the connector manager. If you plan to use multiple connectors, they can belong to one or more connector managers. You will need to install the software again to get a new connector manager, but not if you just want more file system connectors under the existing connector manager. You'll need to tell the installer what port it should use and the IP address of your GSA. The installer will install a modified version of Apache Tomcat, which will listen for HTTP requests on the port you specified. By default, Apache Tomcat uses TCP port 8080. You should check to see if the port is in use before you install. If you install multiple connector managers on a single machine, each will need to use a different port. Once installed, you can configure the connector just like an onboard connector. Go to Content Sources and then Connectors. Add a connector from your new connector manager, typically Connector Manager 1, and complete the configuration form. You'll then provide start paths, follow and crawl, and exclusion patterns, much like you did for the GSA earlier. However, these paths will use SMB pseudo URLs rather than real URLs. The syntax for these is SMB : server name / share name. A single connector can have multiple start paths and patterns. Still within the configuration form, you'll provide a username and password. This account must have permission to read all of the files that you want to index, and it will need to have permission to read the file attributes as well. To get the file attribute read permission, the user will need to be a member of the local power users group on the file server. The account itself can be a local account or a domain account. You may have to configure the global and local namespace fields accordingly. This is only necessary if using more than one set of user credentials during authentication or multiple file system connectors, respectively. This is discussed later in the Advanced Windows Environment module in more advanced training. The file system connector can traverse up to 1,000 documents per minute in an optimal environment. In your environment, it may be considerably slower, so you may have to let it run for a while, days perhaps, to index all your files. Also, some files may take longer to index than others. PowerPoint slide decks, for example, take longer to convert and index. However, serves will be very fast because of the use of early binding authorization. All URLs indexed by the GSA must match at least one follow and crawl pattern. For files from the file system connector, you will use a URL pattern that points to the connector itself. You will need to know the connector host name or IP address and listening port if you're using an off-board connector. On-board connectors will always use localhost as the host name and port 7886 for the port. You will also need to configure the GSA to perform authentication, preferably silently using Kerberos or the SAML bridge for NTLM, as discussed in other training, and identify group membership for search users. This can be done using the Active Directory Groups connector, also covered in earlier training. The AD Groups connector can work in multi-domain environments, and it stores group membership information itself. There are many potential points of failure with any connector. For the file system connector, you should first check to see if it successfully submitted feeds without errors. You can also verify ACLs from within crawl diagnostics. Finally, you can diagnose secure serve problems using serving logs. The error shown in the screenshot is very common and indicates that the account used to crawl doesn't belong to the local power users group on the server hosting the share. Let's take a look at the off-board file system connector. We've already installed the connector on our external machine in the previous exercise, so all I need to do is actually configure an instance of the connector on the GSA. So I'll go to the GSA admin console, go to connectors, and I'll choose Connector Manager 1, and then choose Add. I'll give my connector a name, and I'll choose File Connector Type. Then I'll get my configuration form, and I'll enter the URLs for my start and include patterns. Now again, these are really pseudo URLs. The prefix is SMB. The server name is waterloo.learngsa.com. And it's a good idea to use fully qualified server names here, followed by the share name. It's very important that you use the share name rather than a directory name. Share names and directory names may be the same, but they also may be different. So you have to identify what is the share name. Now, it is possible to point to a specific subdirectory within a share. I could simply type that information on at the end if I wanted to. But right now, this is going to point to the entire share and get anything in that share. I'll need to add what is essentially a follow and crawl pattern. It's called an include pattern here, but it fulfills the same purpose as a follow and crawl pattern on the GSA. I'll also need to specify credentials here. So the connector is going to need to crawl that content. It's going to need a user account that has, again, power user permissions on all of that content. If it has the ability to read the content, but it is not a power user, it won't be able to read the attributes, which include the security attributes, and we won't be able to use ACLs. Once I'm done, I can save my connector, and I should see a little green dot here. And at that point, I just have to wait for feeds. After a short while, I should be able to see my feed here. I can see it's in progress now. If I drill into it, I should be able to see that it's adding ACLs. If it's not able to add ACLs, I probably need more permissions on the user account. After a short while, I should be able to see permissions under index diagnostics. So I can see my ACLs just like I was able to see in the last unit, permitted users, and permitted groups. Now, if the feed didn't work at all, if all of the documents were rejected from the feed, I would have needed to go back under Start and Block URLs and made sure that I had, for my connector, a connector manager URL. So this pattern will match everything provided by that connector. As we've seen earlier, some connectors use the Google connector syntax. Generally, this is used by older connectors, and newer connectors use this connector manager syntax that points to an HTTP URL. Now, to perform authentication, we do have Kerberos set up from earlier, and we also have our mechanism for connectors using the AD groups connector set up from earlier. So I can use those again. And again, I'll be able to do silent authentication. For this, I'll need to go to my Kerberized workstation and go to the browser and run my search from there. Again, this is a secure search, but I should not be prompted for credentials. And so again, I am able to get these secure results. All of these results require security. This concludes our 6th presentation, Searching Windows File Shares. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 100 presentations.